Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lloyd Dabbs. I'm the Director of Public Sector Business Development for Sandbox AQ, and I am excited to be chatting with Teresa Shea today. Thank you for joining. Your background is extensive. I won't list all of your accomplishments here. Former signals intelligence at NSA, former Raytheon, ran business advisement at In-Q-Tel, and of course, you're a main strategic advisor for our public sector portfolio at Sandbox AQ. Welcome today.
Hey, Lloyd, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited about this conversation. I'm so passionate about this quantum science technology, and quite frankly, the race that we're in as a nation to get development, especially, of course, near and dear to my heart in the cryptographic space, and to be there first so that we're prepared when we eventually are all in a quantum world.
That's fantastic, and I think all of us are here because of our passion for quantum. So let's talk about it, I guess. So everyone has been talking about quantum. I just came from a main defense conference where quantum was being used more and more by senior leaders. So when we talk quantum, why do you think it's important? So let's talk about the why behind quantum science and the applications for the U.S. government and military leaders today.
Yeah, so look, I'll start and then, I'd ask you to chime in,
Yeah.
but there is tremendous excitement, not just from the US government, but academia, private sector, because of the possibilities that quantum science is presenting in economic growth, quite frankly. Now, as any technologies, it's dual purpose, right? We have a threat here as well, especially from adversarial nation states, that they could get there first. So it is, that's why I say, I feel like it's a race, and I'm really, really excited about Sandbox AQ and others that are, engaged in the race. Well, but more specifically, Lloyd, let's talk a little bit about, okay, what am I thinking when I talk about economic possibilities and growth? And there's a lot of different spaces. I'll just mention a few: sensing and meteorology, including performing navigation and locating mineral deposits; GPS, global positioning systems that are vulnerable to attack. Quantum science can address that. And I don't know if you saw the National Institute of Health's effort to bring quantum mechanics-based sensing applications.
I did.
That is focused on developing approaches to solving biomedical research. Imagine this, preventing, monitoring, and quite frankly, diagnosing diseases. How exciting is that? I mean, that to me is a game changer. And then, of course, secondly, I would mention communications, the making and breaking of codes. As I said, I think there's a significant threat here that others will be able to break our current encryption methods and steal our secrets before we can protect them. We know today that our data is being stolen and it's being stored by adversaries to break when they do have a quantum computer. So, and when I say data, it's not just about protecting our data, but it's also about protecting our authentication. So knowing and ensuring that the bad guys aren't able to pretend to be you and gain access to some trusted entity. So there's a whole plethora of spaces here that I'm very excited about, and really looking forward to. What others would you add to that I missed?
Yeah, I think you've hit a lot of the main topics. I think one of the reasons I joined Sandbox AQ in the beginning, so my background is career intelligence officer. So of course I was very concerned about the existential applications of near-term quantum technologies. But I think what I like about the quantum science aspect is, for the most part, you're doing a lot of classically enabled technologies that you can convert to commercial and public sector applications today. So everything that you hit on, from sensing applications for health to alternatives for navigation, which I think we're seeing are critically important in areas like Israel, or in areas of Iran, or
Right.
in Ukraine. They're becoming very critical to see things like GPS spoofing and what alternatives are out there. And that's where I think quantum science comes into play. or things in terms of health for drug discovery, where you can optimize and do years of new discovery in months. So those are, I think, some of the more exciting areas of quantum science that really have near-term applications today. But of course, when I look at threats as a career intelligence officer, it is what happens when a nation state gets a fault-tolerant quantum computer. So that's why I think a lot of the near-term focus for government is focused on post-quantum cryptography, and quite honestly, so are we at Sandbox AQ.
So let's talk a little bit about that, this post-quantum cryptography.
Sure.
Can we call it PQC?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Let's call it. It's different from our traditional cryptographic methods. So why, if you think about this, why is it considered essential for safeguarding our very near and dear sensitive information, our private information in this oncoming quantum age? What are some thoughts you have around that?
Sure. Whether you call it post-quantum cryptography or whether you call it quantum resistant cryptography or cybersecurity, the threat is out there. So I think when we talk to a lot of government customers, it is centering around the threat that there are more performant computing capabilities coming out there, whether it's classical, whether it's artificial intelligence, or whether it's the advent of fault-tolerant quantum computers. And when those come online, they have an ability to break your classical encryption. So that's where post-quantum cryptography comes into play, where I think a lot of the approaches related to cryptography enhancement are focused on hybrid encryption. So take your classical encryption methods that are critically important, have protected data systems for X number of years, and then adding that other layer of quantum resistant algorithms. So I think what's important here is it's not completely a rip and replace. It's all about taking your existing systems and enhancing your cryptography for those areas that need to be more critically protected, your national security systems, your health systems, those very important high-value architectures that the US government has outlined must be cryptologically inventoried. And that's the second part of it, is when we talk post-quantum cryptography, the US government does an adequate job. I think there's very good people doing a lot of good work in relation to cryptography management. But it starts with what you know. What is your cryptography baseline and what are your vulnerabilities therein? So any system that has to be successful in government networks has to look at cryptography management as a pathway to integrating these cryptographic algorithms that will protect against fault-tolerant quantum computers that are under threat when data is exfiltrated and, of course, decrypted down the road with a fault-tolerant quantum computer. So I can't, I think, underscore enough how important it is for the US government to implement these strategies now as a pathway to improving the way it looks at overall cybersecurity management in the future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, I'm not a mathematician, but fundamentally, to your point, the math behind PQC algorithms is different. And the current encryption methods that you referred to, RSA, ECC, are all familiar with those that really factor the large numbers or solve those discrete logarithms. PQC is employing a lattice-based cryptography, hash-based cryptography, that to date are resistant to quantum attacks. Now, I think a good question to ask is, well, how do you know that? And how do you know that our current encryption approaches are vulnerable if a quantum computer doesn't exist to prove it? Computers need algorithms to run and to actually perform. And Peter Shor, an American mathematician we should all be very proud of, back in 1994, published his famous algorithm, known as the Shor algorithm, that could solve this factoring problem in a reasonable amount of time. So we know that there is an algorithmic approach, if it has a computationally intensive computer, that we know it can break our current encryption approach in reasonable amount of time. And NIST, for example, has been working specifically on this PQC for at least 7 years, maybe longer. And they've been doing, NIST is National Institute of Standards. I should not use algorithms, I should use words. But they've been doing a great job, I think, of publishing their work for post-quantum cryptography for both Comet and worldwide. Get on this, math guys, and decrypt this and see if you can break it. And the super exciting part about this is here we are into 2023, going into a new year in 2024, and I think the first standard algorithm is going to be published and approved by NIST. So that's pretty exciting for our community. And to all of your great points about why we need to start doing it now and implementing it now is the system of systems that make up our infrastructures. It takes time, effort, money to start this implementation, and so it's not going to happen quickly. But I think from my perspective anyway, the bottom line is if we expect to maintain the integrity and the confidentiality and the long-term security both of our data and our secrets, we need to start that systematic process now.
So I think that's an interesting point when you talk about systematic process, because the government and commercial companies, they love very systematic approaches to transitional things like cryptography. There's a lot of talk in the US government about zero trust implementation and migration across government. And I'd really love to get your thoughts, because we know just amongst our conversations that you really can't implement zero trust without being quantum resistant. So can you talk to me a little bit about how you think PQC integrates into overall ZTA approaches, and what advantages does post-quantum bring to that?
Lloyd, don't you just love that phrase, zero trust?
No, because it's nebulous, right? Yeah, I love it in the context of improving cybersecurity, but it's complex, and I think a lot of stakeholders in government don't understand how it truly applies to them. So
right, it's simple. For me, simple-minded, zero trust implies exactly the right approach that we've been trying to communicate in the cybersecurity world for a long, long time, at least a decade, that the approach to security, don't trust any access or connection until it's verified. And, using PQC integrated into your zero trust architecture exactly enhances the protection of both your data and your authentication. For example, I'll throw a few out there. We've talked a lot about data encryption and needing algorithms that are resistant to keep that data confidential and secure. So, check. Security identities. So using PQC can secure those cryptographic methods used for verification of users and device access. So you're protecting that access process. And with PQC, you've got this suite of algorithms, really. So you've got this algorithm diversity that I don't think we should underestimate. It really adds to your earlier point, another layer of protection by introducing these algorithms, these cryptographic algorithms that are fundamentally different than our traditional methods. And this won't be the end, right? They'll release this in 2024, and then, eventually somebody will come up with a math approach that breaks it, and then we're going to continuously work on this and continuously get in the mindset that this is a continuous process. And if you're a private company out there and you haven't begun to think about this could really leapfrog you ahead of your competitors if you start now in implementing this and spending the resources it's going to take before it becomes a real threat. And then I think both PQC and Zero Trust architecture really benefit from that standardization that ensures that interoperability. We heard a lot from the National Cyber Director and the strategy they released on the responsibility of the developers and owners to really ensure security is built in from design. And that's what this does, right? It builds it in from design. So I think it's an essential part of your zero trust architecture approach. And if you're not hearing about it, you should start asking.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I was actually just at the DOTIS 2023 conference, And as I mentioned
Oh,
earlier,
yeah.
it was front and center, which is zero trust migration. And embedded in that, in the discussions that we had with government and private sector, was a lot of questions. For me, it was surprising. A lot of questions related to post-quantum cryptography integration into zero trust models and quantum resistant cybersecurity as part of the framework. So I think what was exciting for me was I think enough of the private sector's community and the public sector stakeholders coming together to see where those fit in the overall zero trust architecture, which is within your CI/CD, your continuous development pipelines. How do you look at cryptography management for vulnerabilities? So when you implement cryptography, making sure that it's the right cryptography in the right location, which is really fundamental to what we do as well.
Just about everybody that I've asked about if they've done this have found some flaw in their current encryption instantiation. Yeah, for a variety of reasons, upgrades, mistakes, whatever, a whole bunch of reasons. There's not just one root cause. But that in itself can be invaluable, is to find where you're vulnerable, especially on your most valuable digital assets, and making sure, you protect those. Just sort of following up on that, I wanted to ask, because we talked about earlier the fact that we know our adversaries, for example, are stealing our encrypted data. Maybe they can't break it, so they're storing it. So when they do get a capability, they're able to break it. So can you talk a little bit from your perspective, and maybe from the conference, if you had some conversations about nation states like China being this looming menace in this space?
Yeah, so I think it is a big concern for the national security community, not just within the government stakeholders. This is all across the federal civilian government teams, the intelligence community, the Department of Defense. But even when, I think this, when we're on Capitol Hill, some of the top questions are related to near peer adversaries and their technology capabilities as it relates to quantum. So I know whether you look at China or Russia or other types of adversaries, they are making a very concerted effort to develop quantum computers, whether it's key pushes into what they perceive to be the best bets for quantum technologies, or maybe one of the lesser known capabilities. By the way, it's the same thing that we're doing here in the United States, which is pushing the boundaries of what we can do from a quantum standpoint. But all of those mean that we are in a race to get towards a fault-tolerant quantum computer. And I think what we've seen, at least within our circles, is that those same nation states will look at what can they extract now. What data sets can they look at, whether it's long lead developmental programs, think B-21, think very complex command and control architectures, think health data, financial sector data. All of that can be extracted. So when we talk store now, decrypt later, it is quite literally stealing that data well ahead of a new capability, storing it away to decrypt once you get a stable fault-tolerant quantum computer, which by some estimates could be within 5 to 15 years. But we've seen it getting, that timeline is getting faster and faster. So I think that's where the urgency is coming from within the US government, which is to focus on post-quantum cryptography as that defensive layer. Let's protect our immediate assets as we build a longer-term strategy of integration of greater quantum technologies within government. So it's so critical, I think, and this, it is so critical to start with what you know and protecting your high-value assets to protect against fault-tolerant quantum computers. And I think that only stresses the urgency of deploying right away, because migration timelines for zero trust and post-quantum, we know they take potentially decades, just depending on the complexity of the architecture, the diverse nature of the architecture, the age of the architecture, as we've seen in many sectors of the US government. So we have to start now. It's a national imperative to protect the resources that we have, so that we can ensure that future assets are even more protected from some of our peer adversaries. It's a game changer.
Yeah, and I love the way you showed your concern there for the greater good. But I don't know about you, but I was a victim of the successful Chinese attack on the Office of Personnel Management. This is back in 2015. All my private data, which was supposedly being held secret by the government, was stolen. And like many others, I mean, I wasn't the only one, many others, I suffered the consequences of that attack. And I know it can be worse. And a quantum attack on our system would undoubtedly be stealthy, maybe even undetectable. There's been some recent studies, claims about you don't even need a quantum computer. There's nation-state claims and academic claims that a hybrid system that combines classical and quantum elements for computation, such as the Chinese are using in their quantum code-breaking research, can break our current encryption. So even though this may be a silent threat, I think it's significant. And also, Lloyd, to your point, the administration has recognized this, the release of their National Security Memorandum 10 to push the agencies to adopt quantum safe standards now is just kind of foot stomping the exact problem that we have and the need for speed.
No, I think it's so important. And for anyone who's watching this, if you ever want some exciting reading, go ahead and look at National Security Memo 10 or OMB 2302, which really highlights foundationally how organizations within the U.S. government should take an approach for cryptography management. I'll give you a spoiler alert up front and just say it focuses on understanding your resources as a pathway to migration. But I think it underscores maybe a different point, which I think is more on topic, which is, we have these peer adversaries definitely advancing into the technology space of understanding the importance of quantum. I think with your background, I think you're the perfect person to speak to, maybe a coalition approach. So what's your perspective on how important the collaboration is with our Western allies? And could you discuss maybe key initiatives or actions that governments and organizations can take together to combat this overarching threat?
Let's just start with standardization. Our ability to interoperate together between and amongst us is essential to all of us, our allies, our partners, being able to maintain our way of life. Quite frankly, I mean, it's not more difficult than that. I do believe that we need to stay aligned and able to communicate, and we need to be able to share data privately. And we're only going to do that if we're implementing PQC. All of us are implementing PQC. Certainly our allies are a vital part of establishing the U.S. position as a major player in global issues. Not just the conflicts today, you referred to, some that are going on in Ukraine and Gaza, but also the non-conventional threats, such as in economic and diplomatic and cyber and social culture domains. And there is just, you could go on and on about the history and the forward momentum on the value of the partnership with our allies. And I know there's numerous initiatives underway to sort of pursue this international collaboration. I'll just mention a couple that I know of: the National Science Foundation, who's funding quantum science; NIST's work. We talked about the National Institute of, and we talked about their work. And then a lot of private and academic groups pursuing research together. There's never going to be enough money from the government for research and development, and it can't compete with the private sector. Just to throw out just one number, in 2022, the U.S. government invested $1.8 billion in quantum science. Now, you might think, at least I did, that's a lot of money. Until I looked at what China invested. What do you think China invested in 2022 in quantum?
More.
Any guesses? More. 15.3 billion. But just think about that comparison. in the investment. So we need our private sector. We desperately need our private sector. They're essential. Their technology investment and advancement is just essential to the national security space. And Sandbox AQ is a perfect example of that, investing in quantum science, not just for PQC, as you mentioned, but also, in the biology area and the sensing area. So very important.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I was excited to see when I started with Sandbox, last year, which was, how can we help push the private sector along from a quantum science perspective? But more so, I think I've been more optimistic about how the U.S. government can act as a bellwether for our Western allies, right? Which when we talk to our whether it's governmental allies in the West or companies in the UK, France, Germany, Australia, it is always focused on what will the NSA do? What will the United States government do? And they will act when the US government will take a leadership role. Well, guess what? The US government is now taking a leadership role when it comes to quantum and post-quantum cryptography. And we're starting to see not just private sector investment and increases across the board, but we're starting to see our government allies start to build that faith beyond post-quantum cryptography into secure communications and a broader vision of quantum. So that's been, I think, very heartening for me, and I'm very optimistic about what we can do when we're partnering with our Western allies.
Well, look, we can't talk about this technology, Lloyd, without really talking about the talent. Right, for us in America, we've got great talent. I'd love to get your thought on a quantum workforce and how you're thinking about the public sector, which you're part of now. How can the public sector effectively implement strategies and stay competitive in this quantum era? So I know that's kind of a double sword question, but love to get your thoughts both about developing the workforce and about us being able to be competitive with that workforce.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's so important. So I think one of the charges when Jack Hittery sprinted out the gates last year for Sandbox AQ was, how do we take our approach to quantum science and how do we ensure that there's a generational leap forward in terms of improving the workforce? So we know the heartaches that we had with artificial intelligence, and still to this day, many people can just use AI as a service term, but we have to recognize that there was a fundamental educational leap forward from workforce development within the public sector, all the way from senior leader executives, all the way down to the lowest levels within the public sector who had to understand the values that artificial intelligence would provide. That's why there's an A in AQ. Artificial intelligence is a key part of the driver for quantum science. So it was everything from understanding why behind quantum and AI, all the way down to how do you implement things like large language models to really enhance everything from operations to logistics and just across the board within the public sector. So I think one of the things that we're doing really well, and we've got a fantastic EDU team here at Sandbox AQ, is addressing partnerships with the college community, the collegiate community, specifically focusing on recruitment of new PhDs, educational programs to even recruit new folks into the quantum workspace, because it's not all just PhDs, it's all the way down. But it's also establishing our presence within a FedLearn environment so that we can put our educational materials out there for the community so that we can take that leap very quickly. It's so important because when we talk about a talent drain, we've got a significant talent drain in the United States. So we have to put an equal amount of investment into quantum resources, into educational resources, that we ensure we stay at the top from a technology standpoint, which we won't if we continue to underinvest in those areas. So I think private sector and public sector both have an equal part in doing this effectively. And I think that's where Jack and Eric Schmidt at the chairman level have really pushed the boundaries of improving the way that the community understands quantum technologies, and really, I think for my part, it is educating as well. So I will talk to senior leaders, I will talk to legislators, and make recommendations to improve all of those strategies for educational workforce development, because we can't do what we do at Sandbox AQ or one of our partner companies like Connect, or just across the entire space within the public sector without a next generation of talent ready to meet the challenge of quantum workforce technology development within the public sector.
Yeah, and I love, love, love your education tab on Sandbox AQ website. I personally use it for courses, webinars, interviews. I mean, they make it so that you know, it's understandable, not just on quantum computers, but the physics behind it, the large language models, to your point about AI and other AI applications, and just so much on communications and biosimulation. I mean, there's clearly lots of free available resources on quantum, Coursera, and other education platforms. But I use the Sandbox AQ website, and I do this, Lloyd, with my grandchildren, who, by the way, are much quicker to comprehend it than I am. So, you know, that's probably a good thing, but it's a kind of exposure that we need with our early education programs to sort of build those deep roots, because it's undoubtedly we're going to all be living in a quantum world one day.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually some of the recommendations I've made at the legislative level, which is start with K through 12. We have to set the next generation of technology as foundational when we talk development. So, you know, I applaud Adam Green is behind the scenes here. He's one of the key enactors of our educational program, which is just phenomenal. Even I understand it, and I have a psychology degree. So I'm very excited for anybody else that can understand it. So I know we're coming on time, Teresa. So I just want to thank you. Just for anybody out there, just go ahead and look at Teresa's bio, and you will be immensely, I think, probably self-doubting at that point because of everything that she's accomplished. But she's a fantastic mentor to Sandbox AQ, and I'm so excited to work with you. Thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, Lloyd, I really appreciate you having me. It was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa.